Hey, thanks, Lauren, and thanks to the 168 of you who are joining today. Today I want to follow up on Trey's discussion and kind of dive deeper and give you all a bit of an experience of how user experience has been applied in my research. And then I will also apply the concept of user experience to the design of wayfinding elements. And in particular, we're going to see how the Dutch have innovated in their wayfinding design and how wayfinding can then be applied in the North American context. Let's start with a bit of a background, right? Lauren has distributed this earlier. There's one video here and two papers that I've authored, and this kind of will serve as a background for my talk. So go ahead, take a look at those papers, and if you're not really following along in this talk, you can always go back and just rewatch the YouTube video, especially those of you who are joining us on the recording of this webinar. Okay, so it's really good to have you here, and today I'm going to extend on what Trey has already introduced to you about the hierarchy of needs, and this hierarchy of needs kind of illustrates what we are looking for as bicycle infrastructure designers, and I would argue also as urban planners, right? At the top you see awe and enjoyment and reliability, and the bottom you see the basic requirements of safety and security. So what I will argue in this talk is that as we move towards the top of the hierarchy, as we get towards awe and a good experience and something very pleasant and enjoyable, we have to move towards more qualitative methods. We go from a science of design, which provides basic functionality and security, to an art of design. And that's perhaps something that urban designers are very comfortable with, and UX designers, as Trey has mentioned, is also quite comfortable with, but maybe something that could hinder the technical, more technically minded of you on this webinar today. So let's see how these two connect and how art and engineering can kind of work together with both research and practice to make bicycle infrastructure better. So here's the proposition that I want to make. In transport planning, we have a severe problem of A to Bism, right? And what does A to Bism mean? It means that we assume that the origin and destination matter more than the journey itself. We assume that the journey has negative utility. But that is kind of odd, isn't it? That the journey has negative utility. What if it is awe and enjoyment on the journey? Doesn't that mean the journey has positive utility? How does that get reflected in our transport models? Doesn't that kind of throw a wrench into what we've been discussing or the model of which we think transport works? So I want to discuss that a bit further about this idea in both research and practice. And the first item I want to bring to your attention is the idea of preferences and motivation. Okay, so you see highlighted in orange here, preferences and motivation. What's different about these two concepts? I would argue that the difference is that preferences can be obtained from the actions of people. For example, if you pick bike route A over bike route B, you're revealing a preference. But motivation is not so easy to study. We may know precisely what cyclists prefer in general by doing a large sample GPS study, for example, but why they do what they do is going to forever remain a black box, and that is the human conundrum, if we will. We cannot mind read how other cyclists feel or how people pick their routes. We just know the results. But how do we design for this? How do we design for motivation? And what can we use motivation and the idea of a black box to increase our understanding of bicycle infrastructure? So let me take a stab from a research perspective, right? Right now, cycling research is currently divided between revealed and stated preference, right? Revealed, stated preference. Revealed preference is something like a GPS study. So a GPS study, for example, would take your cell phone, which is what everyone carries these days, and use an app on your cell phone to take like 1,000 routes, for example. And we see that out of these 1,000 600 take route B, 200 take route C, and maybe 100 takes route B. Okay, so that doesn't quite add up to 1,000, but this is the left part of this chart, right? What about stated preferences up here on the right side? What is it here about stated preferences that makes it so difficult? So if you see at the top, we have the A/B test. We can ask people about the scenarios, right? So what they would do if they could, which they aren't at the moment because they're answering a question on a piece of paper. And we're trying to figure out what is revealed preference good for and what kind of things that stated preferences are good for. And my argument is that revealed preferences really kind of reveals people's choices and preferences. But as we move towards stated preference, the real value in doing stated preference research is actually in getting at people's motivation. So in going beyond whether it's A to B, because that's been covered by our GPS studies already, and going more into scenarios and asking people why they prefer what they prefer, right? If GPS study encroaches on the territory of revealed preference, then we should be actually taking stated preference to answer our deeper and more fundamental questions about why people cycle, right? And what makes for a good cycling experience. So what do we already know from GPS studies? We can already kind of have a hunch. And I'm going to use the researchers of Joseph Broach, Jennifer Dill, and John Glebe here in their paper to kind of show you what GPS studies have already shown us. And this was already done, before the widespread adoptions of smartphones, so December 2012, right? And they state, right, using 1,449 non-exercise utilitarian trips, they've estimated a route choice model, right? And the findings suggest that cyclists are sensitive to the effects of distance, turning frequency, slope, right, intersection control, and traffic volumes. In addition, cyclists appear to place relatively high value on off-street bike paths, enhanced neighborhood bikeways with traffic calming features, and bridge facilities. I would say that none of you on this call are very surprised at the results of these GPS studies. And if you're a cyclist, they probably won't surprise you either, right? So if you have the experience of cycling and you know what bad infrastructure is, it's not difficult to infer what good infrastructure is. But perhaps what's more interesting to me as a field of research is the motivation, right? Is the motivation of why people prefer what they prefer. And that's something that we'll get into in a moment. So let's go back to our slides here, okay? So GPS, I would argue that we're looking to innovate in the field of inside-out methodologies, right? So we can observe people in their natural environment on the move, but we can also look inside out, ask people what they prefer. And how do we extract that information in a meaningful way, right? So people may say, I like trees along my route. Okay. How do we translate I like trees and greenery into the design of bicycle infrastructure? After all, there's a variety of ways to arrange trees and flowers and the bike path. So this is where we get into a bit more of a design challenge, right? It's not so easy to ask exactly the elements that people prefer. Okay, so this is where the idea of bicycle highways got me interested, right? The European Cycling Federation says that bicycle highways should be at least 3 miles long, 10 feet if one directional, 13 feet if bidirectional, separated from motorized traffics and everything else listed here. But these are really just necessary but not sufficient conditions for a great cycling experience. It doesn't tell you how to awe people, how to make cycling a great experience. It just tells you what the basics are. So here's the basics again in a diagram form, right? Basics. I want to focus us though to the more going beyond the basics, the more qualitative and Ewing and Handy, who does urban design research, they kind of call this like what are the undefinable features, right? What's the remainder after we do the basics? And I think the answer to this, I think the answer to this question comes in the users, right? By studying people, going from inside out. What is important for people who use bikes? And as Trey has said, well, this is on the bottom right, in terms of what are the user preferences of different groups, right? Okay, so how do we design bicycle highways? This is what I found interesting. This is from European practitioners, but it might as well be in North America too. I mean, I grew up in Canada and I've made numerous visits to the US, right? So we're probably a highway society, so we know how to build highways really well. But what kind of logic are we employing? Is the logic that we use to build highways the same logic that we use to design an urban street? And if that is so, then we have to kind of figure out and decide in which logic do we want to build bicycle infrastructure? Do we want to build it according to social logic or traffic logic? Do we want to move from people from A to B, or do we want to design for a good experience, right? And it makes a key difference in how we conceptualize this. Is it an art or is it mechanics, right? Is it a laminar flow applied to clover leaves, or is it something else? So it's bicycle infrastructure like this, but scaled down, right? We can build 50, 60 feet highways. So is this scaled down, or is it more like urban design? So, and if you were to ask an architect, right, this is kind of the sneak Q&As that might be coming up. Is what does it take to build a beautiful building? I would argue that if you look in the design literature, someone has said it's a tension between uniformity and variation, right? That's what creates great architecture, right? These windows here are uniform, but they also have their variations on a theme, and that's very different from what this is, right? This is uniformity with not much attention paid to aesthetics, unless you look back into the 1930s, into the parkways movement, right? When highways were being built for recreational purposes. So what is it more like? Now, as I advance to the next slide, for those of you who watched the YouTube video already, you'll know this next slide, is I ask you this: what is, of the previous two slides, what is this more like, right? And it's literally a bicycle highway, which if this is the utopia that we're designing for, then I would argue this is a bit problematic, because I personally would not want to cycle here, right? And if we're designing bicycle highways like this, we're definitely using the A to B logic. And this is thanks to the bicycle highway that they were building in 2014. I believe it's now finished in the Rhine region in Germany, so they're by the Rhine River. So let's look a bit into what I've just said applied, right? Let's talk about wayfinding. So this is, I want to kind of give you a practical example of what I'm trying to talk about. And yes, that's me. So we did some studies, a piece of research over the summer of 2014 with this question in mind, right? What makes users identify a cycle highway, and what role does wayfinding play in e-bike users' cycle highway experience? Because as we know that from the sales data, that in fact e-bikes constitute the more sales than conventional bicycles. I believe that is in terms of dollars, not units, but still that means the bulk of new revenue is coming from the sale of e-bikes. So we should probably kind of figure out how these new vehicles can be integrated into our existing infrastructure, right? So this is the question, and we set out to answer this question using qualitative methods, right? We'll come back to the findings in a bit, but I want to give it away before you have to sit through all this. So here are the main findings. Before I get started, we'll come back to them. Okay, what did we do? We took a 11-mile bicycle highway connecting these two cities in the Netherlands. They're about 11 miles apart. We thought it was great because that's about the maximum distance that people kind of are willing to travel by bike. If you're a commuter, that's equal to about 1 hour on a e-bike. And this was a bicycle highway that was being developed. So some parts of it are up to standard, and then as of the current day, I think the whole thing has now been signed and completed infrastructure-wise. We did a qualitative interview, so on the go. We interviewed people as they were riding, 12 e-bike users, in pairs, and we also looked at the social aspect. So if they were cycling together, how they interact with each other. Were they able to talk along the way, for example? Did talking to each other then distract them from wayfinding elements, etc., etc. So those were all kind of the things that we were curious about. Right. If you're curious about Dutch bicycle infrastructure wayfinding, this is the current standards. The whole kind of the purpose of this research was also to develop new standards for basically cyclists who are going faster. So these would be typical of what you'll see in the Netherlands. And we took 2 case studies. So one was this thing at the top here, which is more of this shapely kind of sign, and then the second one is this more square kind of thing. So we took half the route was one concept, and then the other half was the other concept. We're also trying to figure out, not only do you prefer the old or the new one, but also in between the 2 new ones, which one do you prefer, right? And this kind of also forms its own branding strategy in a way, right? So one set is on the left, another set is on the right, and these would be used together, right, as a whole. And basically, we found that people overwhelmingly prefer the new signage. We'll take a brief tour in just a second, but in addition, they also preferred this one, the one on the right, the Concept Snell. So the Concept Plus was more alike the old one, and the Concept Snell was more like was more innovative. So I think people preferred the one on the right. And so before we take you to the conclusions, I want to give you like a brief tour of kind of what we're talking about, since we're all stuck inside. We'd rather be outside. So let's see if I can bring you along on a brief tour. Right here, if you look on the right here, you see these little arrows that's on the bottom? So these are like the 3 warning signs before you make a left. So forward, there's going to be a left turn, and then these 3 signs kind of warn you before it's going to happen. And then as you move a bit more, then you get to this warning sign, which if I play the video, there it is on the right, right? You see that? Then that tells you which way to go. So you have a series of preparations, kind of like what you would see on a highway, right? You get some warning before you actually go to your exit. This kind of gives you some warning before you actually make a turn. Right? Pause again up there. Right, that's how small it was and how much higher up it was. So it's very not at eye level if you're a cyclist. And it's not very easy to see. So I find with the old signs that you really have to kind of stop to really squint and see what's there, right? As long as you have the route finding correct, as long as it's clear, where you're supposed to go to get to your destination, you can have your pick and choose of what kind of infrastructure you want, right? And this is a low traffic calm street, right, in the countryside. And then, here's some paving, forest, and then you get into more of the urban areas, right, with trees and stuff. And you can see very few cars. There's no cars at all, right, in this whole journey yet. And then you transition back to dedicated bicycle infrastructure. So it's very seamless along the journey. But it's typically the wayfinding and the transitions that make the whole thing kind of work, right? And now you're on a colored edge lane road. And then, as we get close to the city, the end of this journey, and then I'll wrap this up. Green line, and then we get kind of to a bridge, and then this is much more urban, you can see. What are some takeaways from this? And then I'll hand it back to Lauren for Q&A. Some takeaways, design matters, right? Design matters. Signs alone, as you can see, the infrastructure kind of is there, but it's not coherent, I would argue. Signs alone go a long way. Education is key, right? And clear cycling infrastructure, improves cyclists' level of relaxation. So that's something interesting, right? not something revealed in GPS, but it's something that you can get quite accurately if you ask people along the way how they feel at each point. So let's wrap this up by returning to this pyramid, right? So we have the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right, where we started with, and then Alfonso adapted this to walking needs. Kind of conceptualized this as limits, right, on the bottom versus herbiform on the top, right? And then I kind of was playing with this idea that you get from like quantitative limits to qualitative enablers, right? So you kind of, if something is 50 kilometers away, it's hard to make the argument that you'll cycle there. If the bike path is like 50% longer than the similar driving route, it's hard to convince people to ride there. If it's not safe, right, then it's only the fearless will go. And as you move up the pyramid, it becomes harder to deal with, right? Like, for example, what if we're trying to design something pleasurable? How do we calculate for that? Right, and then here is overlaid onto the bicycle user experience scheme, going from, I think, almost the same idea, right, from basic needs over to qualitative indicators and qualitative ways of talking about bicycle experience. So, going back to your original question, right, which was the original statement was asking about how you feel about cycling. I wanted to bring back up the Menti, which is what you answered in the beginning. And as you can see, right, you answered safety, comfort, connectivity, all ages, separation, access. Some of these, actually, the big points that you've mentioned, safety is a funny one. We try and quantify it, but really, in terms of human psychology, it's really much more about how safe people feel, right? Like airplanes are relatively safe, but it's the stuff of nightmares, right? So I think cycling can be definitely made quantitatively safer, but it's much more difficult to measure the near misses that cause people to fear the environment that they're in. So I'll wrap up and leave you something to think about while we go to Q&A with Lauren. Thanks for your time, and talk to you in a bit.